please join me in welcoming him.
So I'd just like to thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. This is my first time in Michigan, although I have many friends from here and have heard many stories about this prestigious institution. Today I'm going to be talking about the problem of violence in history and forgetting, centering on the issue of legibility. And violence is something that is never thought of as such by the people who perpetrate it. And the question for it is always whether, from what perspective, it is seen as such. So legibility becomes a very crucial issue. And so I'm going to look at this. My setting is early China, but the topic is one that isn't particular to that either time or place. All right, without further ado. In 3 seasons of fieldwork between 1934 and 1935, archaeologists from the Academia Sinica uncovered over 670 sacrificial pits in the Royal Cemetery at Xibeigang, Anyang, shockingly confirming what the fledgling study of the oracle bones had already suggested. The Shang dynasty, China's earliest confirmed historical dynasty, had practiced large-scale human sacrifice at the end of the 2nd millennium BCE. In the decades since those early excavations, archaeological and epigraphic work have only amplified and elaborated on that discovery. It is now conservatively estimated that more than 13,000 human victims were interred in the sacrificial pits in the Royal Cemetery and Palace Temple area. Account of human sacrifice based on the Shang oracle bone divinatory inscriptions likewise yields approximately 12,000 victims, the majority from the reign of a king later tradition extolled for his piety and virtue, Wu Ding. Indeed, passages in early Chinese texts, such as the Book of Odes and the Book of Documents, recall the wisdom and virtue of King Wu Ding. While Mencius comments that due to his sageliness and merit, Wu Ding commanded the homage of the various lords and possessed all under heaven as easy as rolling it in his palm. In the centuries between Wu Ding's reign in the 13th century and Sima Qian's description of him in the 1st century BCE as a paragon of virtuous and diligent rulership, not only had the particulars of Shang kingship been forgotten, they had become unimaginable. And yet, castrated by the Han Emperor Wu Di for arguing the case of a disgraced general, and only a few generations beyond the cataclysmic wars that ended the Qin dynasty and ushered in the Han, Sima Qian and his contemporaries were no strangers to violence. The question then is, how what was sanctioned and glorified in the Shang became unimaginable and forgotten 1,000 years later, even as vistas of possibility opened for new forms and logics of visible and invisible violence. Moreover, implicated in these transformations are not only modes of war, sacrifice, and punishment, but also their objects and structuring conditions, namely the contingent formulations of humanity, civilization, and memory. Beginning with Shang human sacrifice, the first issue is legibility. Shang sacrificial practices are, of course, no less unimaginable for us than they were for Sima Qian, perhaps more so. Nonetheless, the scale, longevity, and resources expended on Shang sacrifice mutely testify to the contemporaneous importance, to the logic these rituals held for at least some of the Shang people, a logic that must be reconstructed if we are to seriously investigate how regimes of violence and memory were transformed over time. The Shang is the second of traditional Chinese historiography's 3 dynasties, the Xia, Shang, and Zhou. Archaeologically speaking, the Shang I will refer to is the polity centered at the great settlement Shang, near the modern city of Anyang, and is known through roughly 3,000 years of textual transmission, 100 years of epigraphy, and 80 years of archaeological excavation. The period of Anyang's preeminence is variably known as the Late Shang, the Anyang, or the Yingxu period in Chinese archaeology, and dates roughly to from 1250 to 1050 BCE. Viewed from the perspective of monumentality and the focus on social energy, the focus of social energy. Oops, I think I'm behind on my slides. Shang Civilization is characterized by large rammed earth courtyard structures, rich burials, bronze feasting vessels, symbolic weapons of bronze and jade, oracle bones, and large-scale sacrifice. Collectively, these were the sites, implements, and media of politicized ancestor veneration, a form of ancestor veneration that, moreover, that centered on practices of sacrifice and war. So, just to go through the slides a little bit. This is one of the early excavations of a royal tomb at Anyang. And I'm not sure if you can actually see the skulls in the ramp. But many of these tombs had hundreds of human skulls decorating the ramps going down. Here's a foundation sacrifice at Sheltun. You might just be able to see, this is the top of the skull, and you can see the skull has been sheared off here by a sharp instrument, hands tied behind the back. And of course, although you can't quite see it, this is Fu Hao's famous Yue axe. It's a full foot across. So the Shang were very interested in spending time and energy, resources on beautiful weapons, such as this jade-bladed, bronze-hafted, turquoise-inlaid spear. Though frequently lumped together in archaeological reports, Shang human sacrifice, I think, is there any way to dim the lights? I don't think you can really see these properly. How about this? It's getting dimmer. It's still not that great. How about this? Can you turn it off? All off. Okay. But that would turn off the podium light, right? All right, let's see what happens. Oops. Off. Oh, okay. Well, I can turn off the lights, as long as you guys promise not to sleep. Perfect. Well, sort of perfect. I have to hold this down here now. Okay. You can maybe sort of see my dark slides. I'm sorry. All right, so although frequently lumped together in archaeological reports, Shang human sacrifice can be broadly divided into two archaeologically distinct phenomena: death attendants and humans used as sacrificial livestock, or human sacrifice proper. Death attendants are found in approximately 2% of the burials at Anyang, usually in the larger, richer graves, but occasionally in relatively small tombs as well. And death attendants can be distinguished from other human sacrificial victims by their receiving what might be termed a proper Shang burial, except for being interred in somebody else's tomb, of course. Their bodies are intact. You can just see these ones in the reconstruction of Fu Hao's tomb, laid out neatly, and sometimes have coffins and grave goods. This one is also laid out neatly. Whether they died to accompany a patron in death willingly or not, and the hands behind the back suggest this charioteer may not have died willingly, death attendants show no obvious signs of violence on their bodies. In stark contrast is the case of human sacrifice proper. Based on inscriptional and human osteological evidence, these were most likely war captives. Their remains can be found hacked, decapitated, burned, or buried alive in sacrificial pits, primarily in the Royal Cemetery and Palace Temple District, as well as in royal and high elite burials. Not only are these two forms of Shang ritual killing distinguishable physically, they also operated in distinct logics. In the case of human sacrifice, the victims must be understood in the total context of Shang warfare and ancestral authority. The Shang kings at Anyang represented themselves as occupying a privileged position in a hierarchy of authority that extended from the lowest creatures through the king and his royal ancestors, the high god Di, and the powers of the land. The king laid discursive claim to the four quarters of the world, pacifying its dangers with his expeditions, hunts, and sacrifice, at once binding local rulers to him with bonds of tribute and reward, with marriage as well as ritual and military protection, or punishment if required. In reality, however, the political landscape was fractured, coercive capital widely distributed, and warfare endemic. As rightful mediators of Di's authority on earth, this is at least according to the royal ideology, the king's military endeavors were therefore figured in terms of punishment, as the terms zheng cognate with correct and zhi cognate with straight, both meaning to undertake a military expedition suggest. Thus, zheng and zhi connote the rectification or straightening out of an enemy. Here you can see some examples from the oracle bone. So zheng and zhi in almost the same sorts of contexts. There's zhi. And both referring to a military expedition. War was, moreover, undertaken with the blessing, if not commandment, of the royal ancestors and higher gods, its legitimacy secured through a cycle of divinations and sacrifices that preceded and continued through any military endeavor. In this divinely sanctioned moral economy of violence in the service of the world order, those rebels or barbarians defeated and brought back to Anyang as captives not only received just punishment, but were put to good use in the community-preserving sacrificial domestication of uncertainty and danger. The actual process through which this occurred, however, took two distinct paths depending on the status of the captive enemy. For rank-and-file captives, a progression can be seen in the oracle bone inscriptions of war and sacrifice. In divinations concerning war, enemies are first referred to by Shang political or ethnic terms, like the Kufang or the Guifang. In divinations concerning capture, they're most frequently referred to variants of the term captive. And in sacrificial divinations, they're referred to as captives or by their manner of execution, such as Fa. This suggests a logic of reduction, as dangerous, named enemies are stripped of identity, becoming, in the end, mere sacrificial objects, interchangeable with livestock, as this mere minimal pair shows. So here we have a divination. So on each day cracked, we should offer a Liao sacrifice to the earth using Qiang captives, so a category of human being. Yi sacrifice a small pen sheep. And then in this other near minimal pair, Liao sacrifice to the earth using one bovine, Yi sacrifice pen sheep. So essentially the same sacrificial offering to the same deity. The only thing that changes is in the one case you have cattle, in the other human. The relative value of nameless rank-and-file captives, moreover, was below that of cattle, at least in Wu Ding's reign, as we see in the serial divination below, or given here. So in this case, and you can see this kind of instantiated in this, graphically, in this pit from the Royal Cemetery, where you have human beings stacked up like firewood, and then one big pig all by itself in a separate pit. So here in this inscription, we have a divination which begins with a divination about sacrificing cattle. They get an auspicious response, but it's only auspicious. It's perhaps not good enough. So then they decide to go for human beings, but actually in larger numbers. So 10, 15, and then finally 20. Great auspiciousness, use this. So looked at statistically, it seems that human beings were offered in greater numbers than cattle in analogous sacrifices, at least in the early periods of the oracle bones. The case for leaders was, however, different. They were generally named in divinations concerning sacrifice, not to mention sacrifice separately and usually singly, indicating a logic of commemoration and trophy-taking, as these two rare examples of sacrificial divinations inscribed on human skull fragments suggest. So, partial inscriptions, Fang leader use, or Fang leader, and then something we can't read or that's missing, ancestor Yi, decapitate. So presumably these were leaders who were taken back, their fate divined. They were killed, defleshed, then their skulls inscribed commemorating the event. And we also see this with tigers and deer, except the inscriptions inscribed on them are usually hunt inscriptions. So this parallel between hunting and war can be seen in this, at least in the field of trophies. Norbert Elias, in his civilizing process, postulates that there is an initial stage of internal pacification, the initial stage of civilizing process. That there's an internal stage of pacification, and the Shang sacrifice of war captives could indeed be seen as a pacifying practice, focused not only on the elimination of military threats, but also the maintenance of ontological security in general. War and sacrifice, moreover, did not found Shang civilization, however, with their violence, but rather constituted its order. The capture and sacrifice of enemies was not merely a military and sacrificial economic convenience. The defeat, degradation, and final ancestral consumption of war captives operated in a negative dialectic of violence, with kudos passing from the defeated to the victor. This transference not only enhanced personal honor, but, through the institution of sacrifice, the ancestral capital of one lineage was expended for the sustenance of another, indelibly marking the simultaneous enhancement of the one at the expense of the other, in the permanence of social, physical, and ancestral death. Shang's sacrificial violence, then, was not merely about reinforcing or reproducing an abstract social order, but rather a patterning practice that inscribed bodies, sometimes literally, as we see here, with the terms of the king's hierarchy, even as it stratified the category of human, from the near-divine and soon-to-be apotheosized kings to the bare life of human livestock, socially dead and soon-to-be ancestrally extinguished. If the sacrifice of war captives illustrates the Shang hierarchy of being on an international scale, then there is no starker instantiation on a domestic scale than the practice of death attendants. Given the importance of the ancestors and ancestor veneration as the principal feature of Shang religiosity, fundamental to the social and spiritual order, to be killed and interred in the grave of another is all the more striking in its radical subordination of being, made permanent beyond death. Looking at the total range of late Shang burials, their division into kin-based groupings, and their significance in the construction of ancestors, if we can argue that the social construction of being for Shang people was predicated on position within a social matrix of living kin, ancestors, and descendants, then burial, as signifier of ancestral place, as the first step in the pacification of the dangerous dead, and through them the ancestral domestication of the social physical landscape, if we can accept this, then burial becomes a matter of crucial importance. Shang burial was a game that was played by all, but with radically different resources, creating radically hierarchical structures of being. This hierarchy was tangibly instantiated in the use of other members of the community as mortuary capital. What the practice of Shang retainer sacrifice had in common with war captive sacrifice was not merely that they both operated they're both varieties of ritual killing, or even that they both participated in a ritual complex of ancestor veneration, but that they instantiated and reproduced hierarchies of being fundamental to the Shang civilizational order. And here you have a large two-ramp tomb with the death attendants laid out, as well as some sacrificial burials up here too. So here you see really clearly the sort of the scale of magnitude of the individuals who were part of this community and the sort of the differential treatment you got at death, or the range of differential treatment. So if human sacrifice and its related practices of war, burial, and ancestor veneration were so essential to Shang civilization's order, the obvious historical question is what happens to human sacrifice after the Shang? The usual answer is that whether seen in terms of captive sacrifice or death attendants, human sacrifice drops off sharply with the Zhou conquest, and in the following century gradually disappears, fading out of all memory but that of myth and fable. In fact, a more accurate description would be that captive sacrifice is transformed and displaced in changing practices and logics of war and religion. Death attendants, on the other hand, remained a stubborn, if increasingly rare and condemned practice through imperial times, repressed by new configurations of human relationships with the living and the dead, yet supported by the increasing power of rulers and ideologies of gendered hierarchical obligation. As the Shang case suggests, early Chinese captive sacrifice must be generally understood as an intersection of war, politics, and religion. While it is true that there is no evidence that the Western Zhou kings of the early first millennium BCE used human captives in their sacrificial offering on the scale of the Shang kings, it must also be noted that neither the palace temples nor the royal cemeteries of the Zhou kings have ever been found, which is where we find the vast majority of these things for the Shang. What Western Zhou tombs have been found show evidence of human sacrifice not significantly different than that found in Shang tombs of a similar class. Nevertheless, the trend apparent since the mid-12th century BC, that's the middle of the Anyang period, was toward a reduced use of human victims in sacrifice, accompanied by a systematization of royal ritual in general. Evidence of Zhou royal ritual from bronze inscriptions reflects this trend. The late 11th century BC Western Zhou bronze Xiaoyu Ding, for instance, though badly preserved and only partially legible, records the Zhou victory over the Guifang and the subsequent display of captives and trophies taken in battle. 4 leaders, over 5,000 left ears, more than 13,000 live captives, 130 chariots, over 100 horses, and 355 head of cattle, and 28 sheep. The fragmentary inscription suggests that the leaders were sacrificed or executed, while the captives and left ears were displayed, then presented to the ancestors in the temple. A fragment of the inscription is up here, and it's actually, well, you get a sense of how partial it is. So people and left ears entered or were brought through the gate and displayed in the west corridor. And then something that's missing entered and were used in the Liao-burning ritual at Zhou. So here in Western Zhou practice, rather than bringing back live captives to sacrifice to the ancestors in their tens to hundreds, the left ears of slain enemies were offered at the shrines of the ancestors, while live captives were divided up among the victors, along with lands and other spoils. And this is probably a trend that began actually in the late Shang. The Zhou political landscape continued to be composed of segmentary lineage polities tied together with bonds of ancestral sacrifice and war. War continued to be figured as a service to the ancestors, and social, political, and religious place continued to revolve around the lineage. Western Zhou war functioned as a tool of punishment, conducted in a moral idiom of divinely sanctioned lineage vengeance. The ritualized execution or enslavement of captives was therefore simultaneously the world-ordering duty of the Son of Heaven, and the precursor of state legal apparatuses. As in the Shang, war and punishment meant, for the loser, political, religious, and social reduction, even death. To understand how human sacrifice became unthinkable and therefore unrememberable, we have to go further forward in time and look at changing attitudes towards the practice of burying the living to accompany the dead. The use of death attendants, unlike captive sacrifice, remained a widespread practice in Western Zhou mortuary ritual. Indeed, there are prominent examples of tombs equipped with more than 100 death attendants as late as the 6th century BCE, as in the case of M1 at Yongcheng, believed to be the tomb of Duke Jing of Qin, right here. It contained a total of 166 death attendants. Perhaps the most famous Eastern Zhou example, however, is the burial of Duke Mu of Qin, nearly 100 years before the Duke Jing. In 621 BCE, or roughly 4 centuries after the demise of the Shang court at Anyang, Duke Mu of Qin, a powerful ruler of the westernmost polity in the Zhou sphere, died and is said to have been buried with 3 good men. An event supposedly lamented in the poem Yellow Birds, or Huangniao, from the 6th century BC Book of Odes. The first of the 3 stanzas of the Yellow Birds reads, "They flit about, the yellow birds, and rest upon the jujube trees, who followed Duke Mu to the grave. Zizhu Yanxi." And this Yanxi was a man above 100. When he came to the grave, he looked terrified and trembled. "Thou azure heaven there, thou art destroying our good men. Could he have been redeemed, we should have given 100 lives for him." This is Legg's translation. The pattern is repeated in each stanza, with each of the 3 victims, lamenting the loss of a life for whom 100 lives would have gladly been traded. The Zhouzhuan, a 4th century BC collection of earlier historical anecdotes, also records the deaths of these 3 good men, noting that the people of the state mourned them. The commentary castigated the long-dead Duke Mu, stating, I got a cold. "As for Duke Mu of Qin's not becoming a hegemon, it is only appropriate. In dying, he abandoned the people. When the former kings left the world, they left behind a legacy of their laws. How could one instead take away good men? By this, the gentleman knows that Qin will never again march east in conquest." Here the commentator, passing judgment on what he perceived to be Duke Mu's selfishness and ritual excess, implied that the Duke straying from the righteous ways of the former kings meant not only failure to achieve leadership of the Zhou states in his lifetime, but doomed his polity to future obscurity. The irony, of course, is not only that the prediction about Qin's future could not be more wrong, but that it was the commentator and not the Duke Mu of Qin who had forgotten the ways of the former kings. Indeed, what is interesting about the earlier Book of Odes poem is that it was not the practice of killing the living to serve the dead that was so lamentable. It was the worth of the victims. Victims, we are told, for each of whom 100 lesser lives would have gladly been exchanged. The Zhouzhuan, though castigating Duke Mu, does not do so on the basis of universal principles of human worth, but rather in terms of a ruler's duty to leave his state strong. This is a case of wasting important state resources for selfish ends. The story is retold with only minor differences in the early 1st century BC Shiji. The difference, moreover, is fascinating. The Shiji, unlike earlier texts, which only mentions the 3 good men, notes that 177 people were buried with Duke Mu. The Shiji, moreover, in an earlier passage, claims that previously, in the 7th century BC, Duke Wu of Qin inaugurated the practice of burying the living with the dead with 66 death attendants. Based on the 186 death attendants excavated from the tomb of Duke Jing of Qin, 177 actually seems like a reasonable number for Duke Mu. From the vantage of archaeology, the 1st century BCE claim that death attendants were a 7th century Qin invention is as ludicrous as it is interesting. Why did early texts make no mention of the other 174 killed for Duke Mu's tomb, given that it seems plausible? How did death attendants become so problematic that their ancient tradition was forgotten and instead had to be ascribed to the relatively recent invention of a semi-barbarous polity? Apparently, by the last half of the 1st millennium BCE, killing even ordinary people to serve the dead had become seen as monstrous. How did this come to pass? Returning to the larger political-religious narrative of the first half of the 1st millennium BCE, the Zhou royal court became increasingly weak over the centuries. After the Shang Conquest, its power increasingly devolved from the regional polities. One material reflection of the court's attempt to shore up its weakening position can be seen in the 9th century ritual revolution, during which the bronze vessels that had served as a central paraphernalia of ancestor veneration became simplified in form and produced in standardized sets. The very regularity of the bronzes in numbers and design, this is what Rawson writes about this, suggests a need for some sort of visible ordering, one much more explicit than that of the earlier ritual system. If the visual order was so explicit, so perhaps was Zhou aspiration to social order through ritual. This was, moreover, a reorganization belying the political weakness of the center. The late Western Zhou ritual revolution was an attempt to impose a new level of legibility on Zhou religious hegemony at a time when that hegemony was losing its political and military basis. In the early 8th century BC, the Zhou royal house was struck a crippling blow as they were driven eastward from their former power base and reduced to mere symbolic status. With this event, the centripetal macro-political integrating function of ancestor veneration lost its practical basis. The ensuing 8th and 7th centuries saw struggles between the regional states for hegemonic status within the Zhou cultural ecumene, as well as a series of usurpations and lineage struggles within the polities. You can see that sort of mapped out here. By the end of the 7th century BC, another ritual transformation can be seen in tomb assemblages, which saw the rulers of Zhou regional polities cast off their subordinate sumptuary status, vis-a-vis the Zhou kings, and at the same time, in an era of civil wars and usurpations, rulers sought to demarcate their distinction from other elite lineages with their own polities. The rulers' tombs took on the form of increasingly large mausoleums, frequently covered with tumuli and set apart from the graves of their kinsmen. With the restriction of politically relevant ancestor veneration of the highest elites, the lower elites were excluded from the formally integrating function of broad-based ancestral sacrifice. Not surprisingly, then, during the 6th century BC onward, across the Zhou realm, the mortuary ritual of all but the highest stratum of society broke from the strict ranks laid out in the 9th century, shifting the focus of general religious practice away from ancestor veneration. This, in turn, led to changing relationships with the dead. To quote von Falkenhausen, in a fundamental contrast to Western Zhou and early springs and autumns concepts, later Eastern Zhou tombs emphasized no longer the community, but the discontinuity between the living and the dead. This discontinuity was manifested in a number of ways, including the increasing physical separation of burials from the residential areas, which was not the case in the Shang, other than the royal cemetery, the growing use of cheaper, miniaturized symbolic funerary artifacts, and the development of tombs as microcosmic reflections of an irrevocably separate world of the dead. Socially and politically, the 6th to 3rd centuries BC were marked by increasing social mobility, economic development, and the institution of reforms aimed at strengthening the remaining polities engaged in intensifying struggles for domination and survival. But intellectually, this period, also known as the Warring States period, was a time of unprecedented intellectual and religious ferment. Ancestor veneration was replaced with state cults of the soil and grain in the realm of political religion. The social-political transformation of the time opened up new religious and intellectual ground in which the increasing possibilities for upward mobility and lessening importance of birth coincided with new ideas about humanity and its relationship with the spirits. If Shang people saw a continuity or hierarchy of beings stretching from captives and animals through lineage hierarchies to the ancestors and ultimately the high god Di, Warring States thinkers envisioned a more fluid chain of being that was less determined by birth than by various possibilities for self-cultivation or even self-divinization. It is in this context of expanded human potentiality, concomitant separation of the living and the dead, and the distancing of rulers from the ruled, that we must understand the changing attitudes towards the practice of interring death attendants in the tombs of the powerful. Attitudes summed up in the 3rd century BC philosopher Xunzi's remark that to kill the living and force them to accompany the dead is hideous. This statement, generally taken as indicative of the humanistic development of Chinese civilization, should instead be seen as the result of eroding social, political, and religious logics, increasing the visibility of a once invisible violence. This, of course, is not to say that while death attendants were being written out of civilization's proper order, other practices of violence weren't emerging behind the screen of legitimation. If the mutable category of human had come to mean something different in the hands of Warring States thinkers, individuals also entered into new relationships with the territorial bureaucratic states than had existed in previous lineage polities. To understand the changed relationships between the individual and the polity in early China, there is no better documented example than the state of Qin and the reforms instituted there in the middle of the 4th century BCE. In the words of Sima Qian, according to the ordinances, Wei Yang ordered that the common people be put in groups of 5 and 10 households, with each member of the group guiding and watching the others, and each responsible for the other's crimes. Whoever failed to report a criminal would be cut in half at the waist. Whoever reported a criminal would be granted the same reward as for beheading an enemy. And whoever hit a criminal would be given the same punishment as for surrendering to the enemy. Commoners with 2 adult males in their families who did not divide their household would have military tax doubled. Whoever won military merit would be awarded higher rank according to his accomplishments. Whoever engaged in a private feud would receive punishment according to its gravity. Now, although this is in a text after the fact, so to speak, what we have of excavated texts, of Qin legal texts, does in fact suggest an incredible ambition on part of the polity, part of the state, to impose this sort of, legibility. The Qing reforms, aimed at organization of the state and its resources for war, attempted to remake the political community institutionally, spatially, and morally. The state was to replace kinship in terms of loyalty enforced with the iron discipline that professional generals were increasingly imposing on warring states' armies across the Zhou realm. The strict punishments and rewards of the Qin ordinances, in effect, remade the polity as an armed camp, mirroring military organization in the imposition of a state-ranked system, and dividing the population into units of mutual responsibility, while assimilating the categories of criminal and enemy in a common idiom of reward and punishment. Over the course of the first millennium BCE, war was transformed from service to the ancestors in the Shang and Western Zhou lineage polities to service to the state in the Warring States period. The Shang sacrifice of captives to the royal ancestors and the Western Zhou presentation of the left ears of the slain enemies to the ancestral altars have their direct descendants in Qin's policy of promotion based on heads taken in battle. What in the one was a service to the ancestors becomes in the other a service to the state. Not surprisingly, along with the nature of politics, punishment, and sacrifice, the practice and nature of war changed dramatically over the 800 years of the Zhou dynasty. Originally conceived as ancestral service and practiced as a means of negotiating place within a hegemonic network of polities, warfare became increasingly bloody, damaging, and predicated on a logic of total conquest. With mass mobilization, status depending on taking heads, and finally the 3rd century BC Qin minister Fan Sui's doctrine of attacking not only their territory but also their people, the final decades of Qin's conquest resulted in a killing on unprecedented scale, including the total destruction of Zhao's 400,000-strong army at Changping, following 3 years of deadlock combat. Whether or not these numbers are accurate, Fan Sui's policy proved effective. Zhao never recovered, and the rest of Warring States history reads like a grim tally of polities extinguished and heads taken by the victorious Qin armies. If it was monstrous to offer the living to the spirits of the dead by the 3rd century BCE, if the moral economy of violence could no longer countenance human sacrifice, the massacres of whole enemy armies was newly seen as expedient. At the conclusion of perhaps the greatest killing spree the world had ever seen, to that point anyway, the first emperor is purported to have stated, "Insignificant person that I am, I have called up troops to punish violence and rebellion. Thanks to the help of the ancestral spirits, these 6 kings," that is of Qin's rival states, "have all acknowledged their guilt, and the world is in profound order." Qin ended centuries of intensifying interpolity warfare with the establishment of new political forms and institutions that would lay the foundation for imperial Chinese history. The Qin and Han empires largely turned their backs on the overt political religious violence of the Shang, and for the majority of the population, violence probably did seem to have been removed behind the scenes, as Elias would have it. Nevertheless, hierarchies of worth and care did not vanish under the Qin. Rather, the hierarchies that in the Shang divided up the category of ren, or human, into a spectrum ranging from sacrificial livestock to nearly divine kings, the moral economies of which provided human sacrifice with its logic, were transformed from ancestral to state logics, becoming in the process ever more expansive, inescapable, and invisible. The systemization of violence in law had the double advantage of distancing punishment from the logic of lineage vengeance and the creation of a new class of non-humans, criminals. Nor is this hyperbole. Criminals in the early empires were literally feiren, not human, as a debater in the 1st century BC text Discourses of Salt and Iron makes clear. They were cut off from society and lineage ritual through their criminal status and the mutilating punishments, from tattooing to amputation, that often accompanied their sentences. Viewed through the lens of punishment, the Qin and Han state hierarchies concerned far more than abstract statuses. Rank moderated exposure to punishment, and sentences could be bought off with a reduction in status, a payment, or the substitution of a more expendable member of the family or a slave. The most common punishment for criminals convicted under Qin and Han law were the 3 to 6 terms of hard labor. Unlike the corvée laborers they worked beside, criminals, as non-humans, were treated as expendable, renewable resources performing the most demanding and dangerous tasks. Many did not survive their sentences. 3 excavated and partially published convict cemeteries dating from the Qin and Han dynasties give an illustration of the conditions under which early imperial convicts worked and died. The largest of these lies near the 2nd century BC mausoleum of the Han Emperor Jing. Like his fathers before him and his sons after, Emperor Jing had his mausoleum built by convict and corvée labor. The nearby convict cemetery bears witness to the human cost of this endeavor. According to one calculation, the convicts died at a rate of 1 to 6 per day, 1 in 10 from sudden trauma to the head-neck region, some bearing signs of mutilating punishments. They were buried far from their kin, with nothing for grave goods but their shackles, seen here, and a bureaucratic epitaph scrawled on a potsherd. There are an estimated 10,000 convicts buried in the cemetery. 10,000 died over the 7 years it took to construct the tomb of one Han emperor. Roughly the same number as were sacrificially punished and offered in the Shang royal ritual over a period of 200 years. In the latter, we can see the operation of a political theater of divinely sanctioned terror and lineage vengeance. In the former, vastly greater in scale, the invisible and implacable workings of law and state. Returning to the issue of memory and elision, the remembering of King Wuding, the first emperor of Qin, and Han Jingdi by Sima Qian, China's first great historian, shows telling contrasts. Jingdi, who may have died when Sima Qian was a boy in the mid-2nd century BC, was neither a founder nor a last emperor, and the building of his tomb merely followed existing norms. Therefore, the expenditure of human life was illegible as violence, and thus unremarkable. Qing Shi Huang, on the other hand, was the transgressive originator of a new imperial political order still seen with great anxiety in the early Han, as well as a last emperor. Not necessarily the last, but of the last. Well, there were only two. A historical position always associated with moral condemnation in Chinese historiographic tradition. As for the Shang King Wuding, who inaugurated human sacrifice on the largest scale known from Eurasian history, his violence was contemporaneously seen as legitimate, and therefore illegible as such, unremarkable, and then forgotten when it was written out of civilization's moral economy of power, legitimacy, and memory. Thank you.